everybody, it's Kara, and I wanted to do a new series of videos called Just the Basics. I decided to do this because a lot of times when I put up my videos on different things that I've created, I get some questions, and I am reminded that everybody has kind of a different level of skill with their crafting, or different lengths of time that they've been crafting. So there are obviously people who are just beginning and people who've been crafting for quite a while. And I thought I would do a series, again, called Just the Basics, to give some basic information to those beginner crafters. I fall somewhere in the middle. I'm by no means an advanced crafter, but I've been doing it for a while. And so what I thought I would share in these videos is just the information that I have found in using different things, and the information that I have learned by watching videos and reading magazines and all that good stuff. So the first one that I wanted to do was about inks, because I know that when you're starting out, if you want to use stamps, then one of the first things that you invest in is ink, and it can be really expensive, especially if you're buying these larger ink pads. They get to be really costly, and it's really difficult when you're not sure of which one you need. You end up wasting a lot of money. So I thought I would do just a brief rundown on some basics about the ink. So typically, when you're speaking generally about ink, you hear about three different kinds. You hear about dye ink, chalk ink, and pigment ink. And I don't happen to have any pigment ink, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. The one that a lot of people use, I don't want to say the most, but I know I see it the most or hear it talked about the most, is dye ink. And of course, there's several different companies that do dye inks. You can see them all over the place. There's a wide range of them, and a lot of them are really good. A few of them have different properties than others, and I'll point out a couple here in just a minute. But the thing to know about dye ink is that dye ink basically soaks into the fibers of the paper, and that's how the color's left behind. It soaks in and kind of grabs hold, and then the colors stay in those fibers and it's left there. It's also why dye ink typically dries the quickest. Obviously, drying time will be impacted with all of these kinds of inks a little bit with the climate that you're living in, and of course the size of the stamp and the image itself. But typically dye ink dries the quickest. It's very kind of translucent or transparent because it does soak into the paper, and it's really not good for embossing because it does dry so quickly. In addition to that, dye ink doesn't really work on slick surfaces. So if you wanted to stamp on, say, acrylic sheets, you wouldn't want to use dye ink because it's not going to dry. You basically are going to be able to, for the most part, wipe it right off. Okay? Now, after dye ink comes pigment ink, and pigment ink is great for people who want to use it to emboss because it takes longer to dry. It's also why I don't have any. I did buy a little bit of it when I first started, and I like to emboss with different color embossing powders, so I did not want to use the pigment ink for embossing. I wanted to use it for stamping. I wanted to stamp it, and I wanted it to dry in a relatively quick period of time. Pigment ink, unless you emboss it, does not dry quickly. It takes quite a while, and it frustrated me, so the little bit that I had I gave to a friend, and I don't use it. Pigment ink takes longer to dry because instead of soaking into the paper like dye ink does, like this kind of ink does, pigment ink actually just dries on the surface, stays right there, and it doesn't soak into the paper, and that's why it's a much more solid looking color. It's very fade resistant, and like I said, it's great for embossing because it does take so long to dry. You can heat set it sometimes, but to me that's just more of a pain than I wanted to deal with. So like I said, I gave those away. It's also harder to get off your stamps, at least in my experience. It took a lot more cleaning to get the pigment ink off of my stamps. And then lastly, you have something that is the chalk ink, and I have a couple different versions of that. Chalk ink is similar. It's similar to pigment ink in that it stays opaque. It doesn't get that translucent look that dye ink does. And while it doesn't dry quickly, it doesn't take near as long as the pigment ink does. And because of that, it's also not good for embossing. So if you wanted to use a colored ink to emboss with clear embossing powder, a pigment ink would be your best way to go. Now I have, like I said, these two different colors, and I've tested both of them out. They both work okay, but I have to say I'm more impressed with the Versa Magic. And I'll show you kind of a comparison of some of these dye and chalk inks. And let me find that. Let's see. So first we have some dye inks. I just stamped out some images of some flowers in the same sentiment for all of them. These are 3 different dye inks, and I'll zoom in so you can see them a little bit better. And let's see, whoops, wrong way. So there you go. Now when I stamped these images, I didn't put any kind of cushion between them, and sometimes dye inks work a little bit better with a cushion, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But you can see that even though these are all dye inks, they obviously are not all the same in how they stamped out. So you have this one over here, and I just stamped it twice because I kind of miffed up that little one right there. This one is the VersaFine. This one is Paper Tray ink, and this one is Memento. Okay, so they're all good inks. I use all of them for different things, but you can see they obviously don't look the same. People who like to color with Copics like to use Memento for that. I like to use this VersaFine when I'm doing a detailed stamp because it's really good for fine details on an image or for sentiments. And then Paper Tray ink I have because I wanted to try out their new ink when they developed it. So there are those examples. Now let me show you another one. I'm going to pull back just a little bit for this one. This one is using the same stamp for 5 different inks. Okay, and I'm going to zoom back down and I'll kind of run through them with you. So these first 2 are dye inks. And you can see there's the VersaFine and there's the Paper Tray ink. Okay, and they both do an okay job. Not bad. But you can see when they have to cover kind of a solid stamp that while they do a decent job, the color is not all that consistent. Okay? Then I have 2 chalk inks, the Versa Magic and the Color Box. And hopefully you can see what a solid stamped image that looks like. And while the Color Box is a lighter ink, I love that Versa Magic. I think it does such a fantastic job. I was really impressed with that. I didn't have a lot of craft ink, still don't. I bought a little bit to try out for this video, and I think I'm going to have to invest in some more. And then this last one is the Hero Arts Shadow Ink. And this could be partly me not putting enough ink on it, but you can see that it's a little bit splotchy. And Hero Arts Shadow Ink, you know, is more of a specialty ink. So like I said, that could be user error because I have used it before and I do really like it. So, in pulling those back, it really looks like the chalk ink probably does the best job with these more solid stamps. And then on the kind of outline one, they're all very similar. But I would say still that I really did like the Versa Magic. It did a really good job. Then I just wanted to kind of show you on sentiments really quick. You have the VersaFine, and again that's a different color red, Paper Tray ink, Versa Magic, and Color Box. And the Color Box of course is a lighter as well. And they all did a decent job. So not too much difference in the sentiments. And then we have the issue with the drying time. So here's the dye ink. And again, the dye ink had some issues in coverage of the stamp, but it dried right away. I mean, basically, I stamped it on, I pulled the stamp away, set the stamp down, ran my finger across it, and it was dry. I did it a second time just to make sure I hadn't, messed something up. And you can see the dye ink was pretty much instant. Okay? Then we have a chalk ink. Same thing. I stamped it, pulled the stamp off, put the stamp down, put my thumb across it, and you can see it was still really wet. 20 seconds later, it's still wet. A minute after that, it's still pretty wet. 10 seconds later, and then 2 minutes, it's pretty much done. I got a teeny, maybe a small, little teeny smudge that you can't hardly see. But at about 2 minutes, it's done. But you can also see, in comparison, that it gives a lot better coverage. So you just really have to decide what you want more, a quick drying time or the better coverage, if you're talking about doing solid stamps like this. Okay?